Most gardeners abandon their projects not in winter, but in July. Not because nothing grows, but because too much grows at once. If your garden feels like a burden instead of a sanctuary, the problem isn't the size of your land. It's the size of your attention. We assume the limit is physical, but the real bottleneck of any system is human focus. Small gardens don't fail because they lack resources. They fail because they overload the only resource that cannot be expanded: human attention. You can buy more seeds. You can build more beds. You can even create more space. But you cannot create more focus, more mental energy, or more daily awareness. Attention is what connects everything in the system. It is what allows you to notice growth, stress, disease, readiness, timing. Without attention, even the best soil becomes irrelevant. Even perfect structure becomes invisible. This is why two gardens of the same size can produce completely different results. One feels calm and productive. The other feels chaotic and overwhelming. Not because one has better plants, but because one fits inside the attention capacity of the person who maintains it. A small garden must be designed for the mind first and for the land second. In our previous chapter, we aligned the physical structure, the beds and paths designed to support the body. But even a perfect frame can feel heavy if the content inside it is chaotic. If your garden still feels like too much, despite a good layout, the problem isn't how the system is built, it's how it is filled. Most people treat a small garden like a container that needs to be fully packed. Every corner should be used, every bed should be full, every season should include as many crops as possible. Variety feels productive, density feels efficient, and empty space feels like waste. But small gardens don't behave like storage boxes, they behave like systems. And systems break not when they lack elements, but when they have too many. Overcrowding rarely comes from one big mistake. It comes from many small ones layered together. One extra crop added just in case. One more variety because it looks interesting. One more experiment because there is still a little bit of space. And slowly, the garden stops being a system and becomes a collection. At first, this feels exciting. More plants, more diversity, more possibilities. The garden looks rich, lively, full of life. But very quickly, richness turns into noise. Everything competes for attention, light, water, space. And most importantly, your time. This is where the main illusion of small gardens appears. We think productivity comes from quantity, but in reality, productivity comes from clarity, from knowing what actually matters, from having a hierarchy instead of a crowd. When everything is important, nothing is truly important. In an overcrowded garden, no plant stands out. No zone has priority. No task feels simple. You walk through the beds, and everything demands something at the same time. Water here, prune there, harvest this, check that. Protect this one, support that one. And instead of feeling supported by the system, you feel surrounded by it. This creates a very specific type of fatigue. Not physical fatigue, cognitive fatigue. The feeling that the garden is constantly asking questions. What needs water? What is ready? What is struggling? What should I do first? In psychology, there is a concept called switching costs. Every time you jump from checking a tomato to wondering why a lettuce is wilting, your brain burns energy to refocus. In an overcrowded garden, these costs are tripled. You aren't just gardening, you are performing high-speed mental multitasking. By the time you finish one row, you aren't physically tired, you are mentally depleted. This is why we stop seeing the details. The brain simply shuts down to protect itself from the noise. And when a system constantly asks questions, the brain starts avoiding it. Not consciously, just quietly. We spend less time there. We check things less often. We simplify mentally. We start treating the garden as one big blurry object instead of a set of clear priorities. And once attention becomes blurry, results follow. Overcrowding also creates another invisible problem. It removes contrast. When everything is planted, nothing stands out. There is no visual hierarchy, no empty space, no pause for the eye. The garden becomes visually dense, which makes it harder to notice changes. Pests, stress, disease, growth, harvest readiness. Everything blends into the same visual noise. In natural systems, signals are always separated by contrast. A sick plant stands out because it is surrounded by healthy ones. A dry zone stands out because it is next to a moist one. Change becomes visible only when there is difference. Overcrowded gardens remove difference. Everything grows at the same time. Everything overlaps. Everything competes for the same light and space. And when everything changes at once, nothing is clearly seen. This is why beginners often feel confused in dense gardens. They cannot read what is happening. The system gives too many signals at the same time, and the brain simply stops processing them. Clarity in a garden is not about knowledge. It is about legibility, about whether the system can be read without effort. A simple test for garden legibility is what I call the one-hand rule. If you cannot prune, harvest, or check a plant using only one hand, because you are constantly pushing away other tangled branches with the other, your system is already too dense. This physical friction is the first signal that your mental friction is about to begin. You aren't just fighting the plants, you are fighting the lack of space you left for yourself. This is why in overcrowded gardens, problems are always noticed late. Not because people don't care, but because the system makes it hard to see. A small garden needs negative space, not as decoration, but as function. Space that allows light to move, air to circulate, the body to walk, the eye to rest, the mind to focus. Empty space in a small garden is not wasted space. It is working space. It creates rhythm. It creates breathing room. It creates structure inside structure. Without empty space, every garden becomes mentally heavy, even if it is physically small. Another illusion is that overcrowding is caused by planting too close. But spacing is only part of the story. You can follow perfect spacing rules and still feel overwhelmed, Because overcrowding is not just about distance between plants, it's about distance between decisions. How many different crops are asking for attention at the same time? How many different growth cycles are happening in one bed? How many different tasks exist in one zone? When too many processes happen in parallel, the system becomes complex. And complexity is the real enemy of small gardens. Small systems must be simple systems, not minimal, but simple, clear, hierarchical, with obvious priorities. This is why many experienced gardeners eventually reduce their gardens instead of expanding them. Not because they lack ambition, but because they understand something important. A smaller, clearer system almost always produces more than a larger, chaotic one. Not more variety, but more actual food. Overcrowding also creates emotional pressure. The feeling that you are constantly behind, that something is always neglected, that something is always not done. Even when you spend time in the garden, it never feels finished, never feels calm, never feels complete. And over time, this emotional background changes the relationship with the garden. It stops feeling like support and starts feeling like responsibility. This emotional shift is subtle but powerful. The garden stops feeling like a place of return and starts feeling like a place of obligation. You don't go there because you want to. You go there because you feel you should. And once guilt enters the system, behavior changes. You rush. You try to fix everything at once. You jump between tasks. You lose the sense of flow. The garden becomes something to manage instead of something to inhabit. This is one of the main reasons people abandon gardens, not in winter, but in mid-season. Not when nothing grows, but when too much grows at once. Overcrowding doesn't just create physical density, it creates emotional pressure. And emotional pressure is the fastest way to kill long-term consistency. A small garden should feel like a tool, not like a burden. This is why the solution to overcrowding is not planting less. It is editing more, not removing plants randomly, but creating hierarchy. Deciding which zones matter most, which crops matter most, which tasks deserve daily attention, and which ones are secondary. A productive small garden is not dense, it is intentional. It has a core, a few main crops that define the season, a few main zones that receive most of the attention, and everything else supports that core instead of competing with it. When the garden has a clear center, everything becomes easier. Decisions become simpler. Attention becomes focused. Problems become visible. And the system starts working with you instead of against you. This is also why the question, "How much can I plant?" is the wrong question. The real question is, how much can I actually maintain without thinking about it? Because the moment you need to constantly think, plan, remember, and organize, the system is already too complex for its size. Small gardens succeed not because they fit more plants, but because they fit into life. They match daily energy, daily time, daily attention. They don't demand motivation, they run on routine, and routine always beats ambition in the long run. Editing your garden is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of mastery. It is the act of choosing what deserves to live fully over what is merely surviving. Ask yourself, if I removed this one struggling plant today, would the rest of the bed breathe better? Would I feel a sense of relief? If the answer is yes, then that plant is no longer a source of food. It is a source of noise. And in a small system, noise is the first thing we must eliminate to hear the signal of a real harvest. Which brings us to the most important part. Overcrowding is not a technical mistake. It is a prioritization mistake. We try to grow too many things before we decide what actually matters. We fill space before we define purpose. And the garden becomes a collection of experiments instead of a system that feeds. This is why the next step is not redesigning the layout. It is redefining the content. Not where should I plant, but what should exist here at all. And before you move on, there is one simple question worth asking yourself. Where in your garden does everything feel a little too much? Which zone feels visually full, mentally heavy, and harder to maintain than it should be? That zone is not telling you that you need more space. It's telling you that you need fewer priorities. In the next chapter, we move from the psychology of space to the strategy of choice. We will define the core crops, the essential set of 10 to 15 plants that form the backbone of a productive system. We aren't looking for variety or aesthetics. We are looking for the ones that actually fill the plate. Because a small garden doesn't need more plants. It needs the right ones. Remember, a productive garden starts with a clear mind. Let's keep building this system together. Subscribe to stay tuned for more essential decisions and strategies.